this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our examination of Plato's Phaedo. Now, we should recall to ourselves the setting of this dialogue, right? So, in the Phaedo, we see Socrates in prison awaiting his execution, which happens at the very end of the dialogue when he's given the hemlock to drink, which is a poison, and we have the final death scene. But prior to that, we see Socrates surrounded by his friends, and of course, as Socrates would be one to do, he spends his final hours not enjoying the sensual pleasures of life, trying to have as much fun as possible, but in his view, undertaking what is his core philosophical mission, which is the pursuit of truth. And in particular, what we see in this dialogue is a final discussion of the immortality of the soul and the attitude we should have toward death. And it's really this latter issue that we've been looking at thus far. So we should recall that in our previous video, we saw how Socrates expresses to his friends how he's looking forward to death, how death is something that he's going to embrace. And he says there's no reason for the true philosopher to be afraid of death. In fact, he sees death as the culmination of his philosophical mission. Now, his friends ask him, they say, well, if that's true, if the true philosopher ought to look forward to death, and if we ought to be true philosophers, then shouldn't the philosopher actually think it's in their best interest to commit suicide? Socrates says, actually, no, this is not the case, and he gives two reasons. One of these reasons we looked at last time. It's this argument based on the idea that we are the property of the gods, and I gave you some reasons to think that this argument may not quite be sufficient. And for this reason, I actually think Socrates' more fundamental reason for saying that we ought not to commit suicide is encapsulated better in the following passage. It's really in terms of the first reason he gives. So indeed, said Socrates, it does seem unreasonable when put like that, but perhaps there is reason to it. There's the explanation that is put in the language of the mysteries, that we men are in a kind of prison, and that one must not free oneself or run away. Now, I told you about this imagery the last time, that our bodies are a sort of prison, and it was foreshadowed for you when Socrates was in chains, and then he removed his chains and felt a fundamental source of freedom. And Socrates sees our relationship to our bodies in the same way. Just as his chains were binding him, so our bodies bind our souls, and we only achieve true liberation at death when our souls are separated from our body. But this claim that he makes here, that the body's a sort of prison, brings up a few further questions. So what exactly is this prison? What is the way in which the body is our prison, is a prison for our soul? And also, how does this show that we ought not to end our lives? The idea is that there's some purpose for which we're in this prison. Right? In the passage he says, we men are in a kind of prison, and one must not free oneself or run away. Well, if that's true, there must be some reason we're in the prison. There must be something we're supposed to do. So what is our fundamental purpose of being in that prison? In this video, we're going to get some further explanation of that, and we're going to look at Socrates' our main argument for why we ought not fear death, but in fact why the true philosopher should be looking forward to death, although not bringing it about intentionally. Okay, now, picking up on this idea that we are the property of the gods, one objection that's leveled against Socrates by one of the people he's talking with, Cebes, is that, well, if we are in fact possessions of the gods, and if the gods are the best entities there are, then why would in fact we want to leave their care? So Cebes says, God is our protector and that we are his possessions. It is not logical that the wisest of men should not resent leaving this service, in which they are governed by the best of masters, the gods. For a wise man cannot believe that he will look at himself better when he is free. But the sensible man would always want to remain with one better than himself. So Socrates, the opposite of what was said before is likely to be true. The wise would resent dying, whereas the foolish would rejoice at it. So the basic objection leveled to him is that, well, the gods are the most excellent caretakers, so we shouldn't, if we're the property of the gods in this life, then we should not look forward to death, because then we will no longer be their property. We will have been destroyed. And while we're their property, we're under the guidance and under the tutelage of the best possible masters, of the best possible, you might even say, parents. Now, Socrates' response is interesting here because, in fact, he says, based on, a large extent to the sort of legends that were popular in Greek mythology, he says this is not something we have to worry about. Socrates says, for Simmias and Cebes, I should be wrong not to resent dying if I did not believe that I should go first to other wise and good gods, and then to men who have died and who are better than men are here. But assured that as it is, I expect to join the company of good men. This is why I'm not so resentful, because I have good hope that some future awaits men after death, as we've been told for years, a much better future for the good than for the wicked. So, and we saw this in the Apology, where Socrates says at the very end that one of the substantial possibilities for death is that he'll be able to continue his philosophical mission in the afterlife. And if in fact he can continue his philosophical mission in the afterlife, talking to the greatest of men, the greatest of philosophers, then of course for the true philosopher, death is something that you would embrace. So he brings this point up again here. And the main philosophical question I want to ask here is, put aside the story itself. You might accept or reject the story. It's largely based on a myth. But from a philosophical point of view, what would have to be true for that story to even be possible? And you can say the same thing about many of these stories of the afterlife that are currently very popular in the monotheistic and modern religions of today, which also talk about heaven and hell and an afterlife. So the first question we have to ask is, what must be the case, what must be possible for anything like that to be true? Bracketing for the moment whether it actually is true. And what I would suggest is that really there are three different questions that we would have to answer to know whether something like that is possible, whether surviving your own death in the afterlife is possible. Three questions. The first I'm going to call the composition question. And the composition question just is this. It refers to what is a human being composed of? Is a human being composed of just a material body, right? Just your arms and legs and your heart and lungs and all the physical components down to the smallest atoms or subatomic particles that make you who you are? Is that fundamentally what you are? Just a physical body? Or are you a physical body plus something immaterial? Now, what do we mean by immaterial? Well, you might say supernatural, right? But I think a better way of just explaining is not material. Not a material substance. Not something you can run up into in space and time. And the most common name for something like this that we associate with people, and that Plato talks about as well, is a soul. So on one view, we're just a physical body. On another view, we have an immaterial soul. So that's the composition question. Now, so a couple points to make about this. First, in this particular dialogue, Plato doesn't give, he believes we have an immaterial soul, but he doesn't give any reasons to think that that is true. It's not that he doesn't have any reasons, it's just that his purpose, as we're going to see, his purpose in this dialogue is somewhat different. So the discussion unfolds basically on the assumption that human beings are a composite of a physical body and an immaterial soul, and we've actually already seen this to some extent because the way he defines death is the separation of soul and body. Okay, now, so let's take this assumption on board. Let's say, in fact, that human beings are a physical body and an immaterial soul. Now, notice that this makes it possible for us to survive our death, as we talked about last time, because now when your body dies, now when your body decays, when all the functions that give your body life cease to function properly, there's still something left over that can survive. Okay, so, but that's not the only thing. Even if we do have this immaterial soul, that's not the only question we have to answer. Take a look at another of the questions, which I'll call the personal identity question. So, let's say you have a immaterial soul, and let's say after you die, the soul leaves your body, it separates from your body, and goes into some sort of afterlife. Whether the heaven that is talked about, for instance, in Christianity, or the afterlife which Plato is envisioning through his Greek mythology. So let's say you have some sort of soul that's going to that afterlife. There's a further question. Imagine, for instance, right, your body dies, your soul leaves your body, and your soul is in heaven or in an afterlife. And now imagine you could sort of think about that from a third-person perspective and ask yourself, is that thing that is in this afterlife, is that me? If you imagine your sort of previous self being reincarnated and looking from afar at your soul in the afterlife, would your previous existence say, oh yeah, that's definitely me. Whatever that thing is that's in the afterlife, that is identical to the person I am now? Or would your previous self say, that might have been a part of me, but that is not a thing I recognize at all. It's living an existence extremely foreign to who I am now. It's living an existence I simply do not recognize. Would your previous self look at your soul in an afterlife just as you might now look at someone living on the other side of the world and say, that's a completely different person from me? Now, to get a better handle on this question, because it is an abstract question, I think one that's a little more difficult to understand than the composition question, think about the fact that whenever Socrates talks about the afterlife, not only in the Phaedo right now, but also in the Apology, he envisions it as a scenario in which he is engaging in philosophical discussion of the sort that he is doing now. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Why is Socrates envisioning the afterlife as a continuation of the things he's doing now? Well, one way to think about it is that in order for you to see that soul which survives your bodily death as being identical to you, as actually having your personal identity, it might make sense to think, well, that soul has to share some of the fundamental activities I'm doing now. If that soul lived a life that I found completely foreign, had none of my current interests or desires or wants, if it was living a life that is so different from my life now, which would be the case because it's disembodied and so much of our lives are conditioned by our bodies. But if it was living a life that's so much different from our life now, it might be hard to say that's actually you. So Socrates always seems to talk about the afterlife as something he can sort of sympathize with. It's something that he recognizes as him. And notice, this is an important question to keep in mind as we move through this dialogue, because if you imagine that you have a soul which survives your death and lives in an afterlife, but if that soul isn't you, then notice that your soul being in an afterlife is no benefit to you. If your soul is not who you are, then the fact that your soul survives your body doesn't really matter to you any more than, when you get a haircut and there's hair on the ground, you say, yeah, I left part of me behind, but of course that's not really me, so it doesn't matter. So there's a further question here. Socrates, or really Plato needs to claim not just that you have a soul, but also that that soul after your bodily death is you, and not just some part of you that now is going on without you, that you're leaving behind, as it were. So that's the second question, and this is a question that will come up at certain points in the dialogue or through certain implications, but it's not the primary thing that Plato is concerned about. The primary question that Plato is concerned about in this dialogue is what I'll call the persistence question. And the persistence question just is this. Suppose you have a immaterial soul. Does that soul outlast your body, or does it die when your body dies? So here are the two options. Again, we're assuming that you have this immaterial soul. One thing we don't often think about is that for all we know, it could be possible that when your body dies, the soul dies as well. Or even if they don't die at the same time, maybe your body dies and maybe a day or a week or a month or a year later, your soul dies. Maybe just like bodies wear out, souls wear out too. And maybe for whatever reason it takes a soul longer to wear out, but maybe the soul still wears out and eventually it dies. Now, in fact, Plato rejects that, and the main topic of this entire dialogue, when we get into the major arguments which form the heart of the middle of the dialogue, he's asking the question, is the soul immortal? Is it possible the soul is just scattered away or destroyed when the body dies, or does the soul live on forever into eternity? And this was something Plato believed, although in a different form than many monotheistic religions today. But of course, this is a belief that we see in many of those monotheistic religions of today as well. And this is the primary question we're going to be concerned with. Is the soul immortal, or does the soul die when the body dies, or sometime thereafter? And of course, this is important for Socrates' claim, because remember, Socrates wants to say the true philosopher has no reason to fear death. The true philosopher should embrace death and be hopeful and optimistic about death. But that's only going to be the case if your bodily death is not the end. But if the soul dies when the body dies, then for Socrates, he won't get to continue his philosophical mission. He won't be discussing philosophy with great people of the past, or even the gods, as he talks about. Okay, so these are the three questions: the composition question, persistence question, and identity question. And as I said, the main topic will be this persistence question. Okay, now, there's another thing to think about here as well. In this passage, which I have here, I'm going to read through a little bit, Socrates makes some striking claims about the nature of death and about the relationship between death and philosophy. So he says, I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death and be very hopeful that after death he will attain the greatest blessings yonder. So he's not only optimistic about death, he thinks he will attain the greatest blessings from his death. Later he says, the aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for death and dying. Now, if this is true, it would be very strange indeed if they were eager for this all their lives and then resent it when it comes. So not only does he think that our death gives us the greatest blessings, but he also says, and this gets to the idea of why it would be wrong for us to end our lives, of the purpose we have in our lives. He says the purpose we have in our lives is to practice or train ourselves to die. And notice how different this is from the common attitude that we take toward life and death. It's often said that we shouldn't waste a moment of life because death is coming. Death is on the horizon. We need to squeeze every ounce of enjoyment out of life that we can, because when death comes, we will have it no more. It's a precious, good, a rare resource that once it's gone forever. But Socrates says, no, if it's the case that the culmination of philosophy is death, then what we should be doing is we shouldn't see life as good in itself. What we should see is life as an instrumental good. It's a time to practice and prepare ourselves for our death. We need to live in a way that will prepare us for when it's time to die. And now, so you should probably be asking yourself questions like, well, what does that mean? What do I need to do in preparation for my death? Do I need to pack my suitcase? What do I need to do? As we're going to see, Socrates thinks the way you practice or train for death is by gradually separating yourself from the body in a way that will allow the soul to completely separate from the body at your death and finally live a life of eternal bliss. But we'll get to more of that later. So first, death provides the greatest blessings. Life is a training for death. And then finally, one of the maybe strangest and most striking statements he makes, Socrates says, I think the majority on hearing this will think that it describes the philosophers very well, and our people in Thebes would thoroughly agree that philosophers are nearly dead, and that the majority of men is well aware that they deserve to be. So there's a couple things, and there's some ironic humor thrown in here too. He talks about the fact that philosophers are nearly dead. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, one way to think about this is, consider for yourself, sometimes we ask ourselves the question, when is it that you felt most alive? What are those moments in your life that you felt most alive, that you were living life to the fullest? It may have been through very intense experiences with another person, through very exciting adventures, through extremely pleasurable circumstances. Like, you don't usually say, that you're living life to the full, so you feel most alive when you're doing daily tasks like taking out the garbage or doing the dishes. It's novelty, it's excitement, it's being in touch with your body, it's experiencing pleasure. All these things make us feel the most alive. But he says philosophers are nearly dead. And he says a true philosopher is nearly dead because the true philosopher has been training their entire life for death. They've been preparing for death. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that what it means to train for death is to separate ourselves from the body And what that means is to separate us from those experiences which the majority, as he puts it, would commonly make us feel the most alive. So if most people think that what it truly means to live is to pack in as much pleasure into their lives as possible, as much excitement, Socrates has said we need to separate ourselves from those things. As we'll see shortly, he says a true philosopher has no concern for the pleasures of the body. The pleasures of eating and drinking and sleeping and sex. They do these things to sustain the body just as is necessary. But the focus of the true philosopher is not on the pleasures of the body. It's on separating ourselves from those things. It's on disregarding those pleasures. And I think it's very interesting that Socrates says here, the majority think the philosophers are nearly dead and they deserve to be. Because most people would look at this life that Socrates is recommending of separating oneself from the body and the pleasures of the body, and they would say, that's not a life worth living at all. Right? They would say, such a life is boring, dull, insipid. It's not making the most of every day. And so, yeah, the philosophers deserve to be dead because they're not truly living in the first place. Of course, here we should think back to the Credo, where we've already seen that Socrates says we should disregard the majority opinion because the majority are not experts in the first place. But in any case, so we have these three major questions. What are the greatest blessings a philosopher receives on death? What does it mean to practice for death and dying? And why is the philosopher nearly dead? And I've suggested some preliminary answers to those. So with all this in place, I think we can get a better picture of why Socrates says the true philosopher should not fear death, or at least a more systematic picture. And so the argument he gives, I'm going to call it the argument from true philosophy. It's the idea that based on what we know about what the true philosopher is doing, it follows that the true philosopher should embrace death. So, premise one of the argument. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. I've already shown you this passage where, in fact, he talks about this. He defines death as just the separation of the soul from the body. Right now, they're fused together in some sense. Right? The body and the soul are together, which is a whole philosophical question in itself, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. So right now the body and soul are together, but when the body dies, they separate, and that's what death is. And of course, this has a couple of important implications. One, it has some implications for personal identity. If death is just the separation of the soul and the body, and the soul is what lives on afterwards, then that means what you are is your soul. And that implies a very particular sort of relationship to your body. We often, just in an everyday sort of sense, if you look down your body and you say, well, this is what I am. I'm this concatenation of arms and legs and my head and all the internal organs, that's what I am. But of course, if Socrates is right, then actually that's not what you are. You are your soul. And your body is just something you're using. Your body is sort of like a car that you're using to get around town, right? So when you're driving in your car, you are not the car, it's just a tool you're using. And likewise, his position on death implies that what you are is your soul, and your soul is somehow connected to and using your body as a way of moving around. So you are not your body, you are your soul. Second implication, and this relates back to this idea of why the true philosopher rejects the pleasures of the body, there's some implications for well-being. Right, so if you pursue a life of pleasure, then at most what you're doing is benefiting the soul. Most what you're doing is benefiting the body. But you're not benefiting the soul because Socrates associates pleasure with the body. And so that means that if you live a life seeking the pleasures of the body, you're not actually benefiting yourself. It would be like a life where you, to use the car analogy again, it would be like a life where you spent all this money souping up your car, putting in a nice sound system, getting a nice paint job, getting a high-performance engine in your car, and never attending to any of your own affairs. You would have done a great service to your car, but you would have done nothing for yourself. So if Socrates is right, you are your soul, and what it means for you to live well is for your soul to do well, which we've seen as a common theme from Socrates, that our soul does well to the extent that we pursue the truth and gain knowledge. Okay, so the first premise just is, death is the separation of the soul and the body. Now, the second premise, as I've already hinted at, the purpose of the true philosopher is the attainment of knowledge. We've seen this repeatedly throughout the Socratic dialogues, and there are many statements throughout the Phaedo which confirm this. So, one point it says, true philosophers are those who desire truth. True philosophers love learning, or they're lovers of learning. And one of the more provocative and interesting statements to me, a true philosopher is one who has seriously concerned himself with the pleasures of learning. So Plato consistently associates philosophy or true philosophy with the attainment or pursuit of knowledge. And as I was saying before, it is for this reason that the true philosopher despises or rejects the pleasures of the body. So do you think it's part of a philosopher to be concerned with such so-called pleasures as those of food and drink? By no means. What about the pleasures of sex? Not at all. Do you think he values these pleasures or despises them? I think the true philosopher despises them. Right, and that makes sense. If what is good for us is what's good for our soul, and what's good for our soul is knowledge, the pleasures of the body should really be irrelevant to a true philosopher. And as I was saying before, this means that the true philosopher is not concerned with the body, but only concerned with the soul. Do you think, he said, that in general, such a man's concern is not with the body, but that, as far as he can, he turns away from the body towards the soul? I do in fact think that. The philosopher, more than any other man, frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible. And this really is the issue. How do you live a life where you liberate your soul from the prison of the body? And this will be a crucial theme as we continue to read through the Phaedo. Okay, so if we take these two premises together, P1 and P2, death is the separation of the soul from the body. The purpose of the true philosopher is to attain knowledge. P3, one can attain knowledge only if one's soul is separated from one's body. If you take P1, P2, and P3 together, you get the conclusion that C1, the true philosopher, can only achieve her purpose if she has died. Now you notice that there's one premise I haven't explained yet. Premise 3. One can attain knowledge only if one's soul is separated from the body. Right, we've seen what Plato thinks death is. We've seen that the purpose of the philosopher is to attain knowledge. But why does Plato think we can only attain knowledge when our soul is separate from the body? Why can we only attain complete knowledge in the afterlife once we have died? What is it about the body? What is it about our existence in this life which prevents us from attaining knowledge? Those are questions which I'm actually going to leave to the next video. So for the moment, we're going to leave P3 as it is unjustified, and we'll come back to it in the next video because it forms a crucial aspect of Plato's philosophical thought. But if you accept P1 through P3, then you get the conclusion the true philosopher can only achieve her purpose if she has died. Then P4, if the true philosopher can achieve her purpose only if she has died, then the true philosopher should not fear death, but should face death with great cheer. And we see Socrates saying this. He says again, it would be strange indeed if they, the philosophers, were eager for this all their lives, and then resent it when what they want to have happened and practiced for a long time comes upon them. So it would be so strange if the philosopher has been preparing themselves, training themselves for death, and they know that after death they'll get the culmination of their philosophical mission. They'll finally be able to attain the knowledge and truth which had eluded them in this life. And it would be weird if once that person came to the moment where they were going to die, they resented it, they wanted to escape it, or were saddened by it. And of course, this perfectly explains why Socrates has this view, or has this disposition of happiness and cheerfulness in the face of his death. Because this is the moment he's been waiting for and training for and practicing for. So we can see with these claims why in fact the true philosopher should not fear death, but should face it with good cheer. Now, as I said, we have not touched the most important premise of this argument, that's P3. We need to have an answer to the question why it's only possible to attain knowledge after we've died. And as I said, we will look at that in the next video. So I will stop there. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you next time.